This is Mrs. Palmer-Quay for the first video for Unit 15. We'll be talking about a specific member of the excretory system in this video, more specifically about the urinary system. We've already talked about several excretory systems as we've looked at other body organ systems. In the integumentary system, sodium is excreted through sweat, and of course excretion is any way of moving waste products out of the body. In the respiratory system, we excrete carbon dioxide every time we breathe, and there are certain other molecules that can go out on the breath. Our digestive system, of course, excretes indigestible food wastes moving through the large intestine. And then today we're going to be looking at the urinary system, which excretes excess water and various substances which will dissolve in that water. So the urinary system is really very, very important in maintaining homeostasis. It is involved in keeping our blood and body fluids at the proper pH and the correct amount of ions, electrolytes, positive and negative little pieces of molecules or elements, keeping those in all the proper balance. It is probably the most important system for homeostasis. It also, as I've just said, removes toxic wastes, things that are byproducts of metabolism that's going on in our body all the time. More particularly, it tends to get rid of those things that come from digesting food and from breaking down protein. The kidneys, which are the large functional organ in the urinary system, they filter about 150 liters of plasma a day. Now we only have about 3 liters of plasma in the body, 6 or so liters of blood, and half of that is plasma. And so actually our plasma runs through the kidneys about 50 times, but only a tiny piece of that is actually then excreted as urine, about 2 liters on average. So you can already see that even though a lot is being filtered, there must be an awful lot being reabsorbed for us to end up with such a big difference between how much is filtered and how much is excreted. The structure of the urinary system consists of just a few organs, the kidneys, which are connected to long tubes called ureters, which go to a storage organ known as the bladder, which has a connection to the outside world through the urethra. The functional unit of the kidney is the nephron, and this is the place where filtration happens and reabsorption and secretion. This puts the kidneys in a more global perspective in the body. You will notice that the right kidney is slightly lower than the left kidney. That's because the liver is sitting above the kidney, and so it has to kind of slide down a little bit to make space. You will also remember that the adrenal gland is located on top of the kidneys like a cap. And look to see how the kidneys are really enclosed by the rib cage. They are much higher on your back than many people believe. You kind of think of them as being in the lower back, in sort of this space here between your rib cage and your pelvis, but they're actually protected by your ribs because they are an essential organ. The kidneys have one connection to the vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and one large artery going to the aorta. So there's just one large blood vessel going into either kidney, one from the arterial system, one from the venous system. That makes it easy for kidney transplants to occur because doctors only have to worry about reattaching these two large blood vessels, and then all the blood supply to the kidney has been established. You can see here here comes the ureters down to the bladder, and then out, this is a male, out to the urethra, to the exterior world. So the kidney looks like a kidney bean. That's where it came from. It's a reddish-brown bean-shaped organ with a smooth surface, and it is well hidden behind the peritoneum. It's retroperitoneal. It's not part of that abdominal cavity serous membrane. In fact, if we were to open up a cadaver and clean the intestines and all out of the abdominal cavity, you still wouldn't see the kidneys because there's a whole layer of connective tissue on top of it. The interior of the kidney has two parts. It has a cortex and a medulla, and you should be able to already picture that the cortex is then going to be talking about the part of the kidney around the outside, and the medulla will be in the center. So looking at a kidney a little bit more closely, you can see we've got this cortex area around the outside, and then the medulla is everything else in the middle. And much of the medulla has sort of a striated appearance, and then there is just a membrane sort of space in the center. And so the functional unit of the nephron is found up here in the cortex and extending down into the medulla. Some of the nephrons sometimes just stay in the cortex and they're little structures, but many of them are going looping down right into the medulla. Collecting ducts are what happens after the urine has been made. The collecting ducts then move out of the medulla and down into this is sort of the renal pelvis, is this empty space in the middle of the kidney, which then would empty into the two ureters, depending upon which kidney you were in. Other structures that you see here, the kind of the cup-like ends of all of these collecting ducts, you see sort of little loopy sections here. Those are known as calyces, or singular would be a calyx. So a small one would be a minor calyx, and a larger one is a major calyx. And so that just is talking about a space, really, where all of the little drips and drops of urine will be coming out, and then sort of collecting here in the middle in the renal pelvis until it can drip down the ureter. Moving over to this far right, we're looking at an individual nephron, just kind of opened up. We can see that it has a renal corpuscle, and we'll talk about the corpuscle a little bit later. And then it has a very squiggly tubule that loops down and comes back up and it's squiggly again. So we have a proximal convoluted tubule close to the renal corpuscle, the loop of Henle, and I'll get all to these on another slide, and then the distal convoluted tubule. And then from here it goes into a collecting duct and makes its way out of the kidney. So what does the kidney do? What's its function? Well, it is the organ that's involved in regulating the volume and the composition and the pH of body fluids, most specifically by working with the blood. The kidney removes these metabolic wastes that have been floating around in the blood and excretes them to outside of the body. You also have already heard from previous videos how the kidney is involved in red blood cell production through erythropoietin or erythropoietin, depending upon how you want to say that, the hormone, and how it's involved in regulating calcium ion absorption by working with the parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone acts on the kidney to bring calcium ions either into the body or out. And also we'll be talking quite a bit on how it's involved in regulating blood pressure, specifically by changing blood volume, by moving water in or out of the bloodstream, by how sodium ions are moving. Kidneys are an essential organ. You can't live without it, but you can live with only one. If you only have one kidney, you do have to be a little careful about what you eat, but it certainly is not a major issue. If you do not have any functional kidneys, then you can be kept alive for a while going on dialysis machines, but you are sitting down and having your blood filtered through the machine every couple of days. So certainly having a kidney or working kidney inside you is the preferred way to go. So as I mentioned earlier, kidneys have a direct connection to the aorta and the inferior vena cava because they are filtering so much blood. And in the renal corpuscle, you have your arteriole, which divides down into capillaries and then recombines back up into an arteriole. So you've got this arteriole coming in. I probably should do this in red since we're talking about arteries. So arteriole coming in, and then it's dividing into numerous capillaries here. And then those all are combining again into another arteriole. And then it keeps on going and becomes, as you see here, a peritubular capillary around the tubule of the nephron, and so then it can provide the nutrients needed for the various cells that are part of the tubule. Here we have a plasticized kidney showing you the very, very deep vascularization of this organ. That I think about 20% of the blood at any one time is passing through your kidneys. There's a lot of blood moving through there because it is such an important organ. So let's talk about nephrons, the functional unit of the kidney, the place where blood is filtered, which basically just means it's moved out of the blood to someplace else, or blood is moved out of the bloodstream to someplace else. Beneficial molecules and water is reabsorbed. Other molecules are secreted, so reabsorbed is coming out of the filtrate and going back into the bloodstream. Secretion is coming out of the bloodstream and going into the filtrate. And then eventually these wastes are excreted in the form of urine. And various sensors in the nephrons in the kidneys are all looking at what's the pH of the blood, what's the pressure of the blood, what's the red blood cell count. These are all things that are being evaluated and adjusted through the homeostatic mechanisms, some of which we've talked about already. Taking a little bit deeper look at the nephron structure, you have, as I said, you've got this group of capillaries, and this is called the glomerulus. So this is where your afferent arteriole divides into capillaries, which then it comes to an efferent arteriole. And surrounding this little knot of capillaries is a sac of tissue known as Bowman's capsule. And so that the filtrate will move out of the capillaries and into the space that's created by this surrounding layer of tissue of Bowman's capsule. This whole thing together is known as the renal corpuscle. From the Bowman's capsule, then, the membrane of the tubule comes together to make this little tube. And as I said on the previous slide, you have the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, and the distal convoluted tubule before you get to the collecting duct. The filtration rate is approximately 120 milliliters a minute. So in about 10 minutes, a full liter of fluid has moved out of your blood and into the system in your kidneys. Now obviously most of it has to move back because you only have about 7 liters of blood, and so in an hour you would be completely dried out, dehydrated husk so far as your blood's concerned. And so really there's so much of the filtrate that goes out is actually reabsorbed. It's kind of like it's one source I was looking at, it says it's like someone's doing a garage sale and they pull everything out of the garage and put it all on the front lawn, and then they put back the things that they want to keep, and maybe somebody makes a decision and takes something back out again, but it all gets thrown out first, and then you decide what you're going to do with it, and that's what's happening in your kidneys. This picture here on the top is just showing you the afferent arteriole coming in and the capillaries that we can't see in the glomerulus. Surrounding them are a particular kind of cell. We've got specialized cells known as podocytes or podocytes that just continue to make sure that no large molecules, say a red blood cell, doesn't come out, because the capillaries in the glomerulus are very, very leaky. They have lots of holes in them. They're known as fenestrations, so these are very fenestrated capillaries, in order to allow the filtrate with all of the various components of the blood to be poured out so it can be evaluated by the various tubules of the nephron. And so these podocytes are part of the system to make sure not too much of the big things go out, but sort of only the small to medium size molecules. Filtration happens by pressure, if you remember. So the blood going into the system here has a hydrostatic pressure of about 55 millimeters of mercury. And the colloid pressure, the osmotic pressure that's kept by the albumin, which does not go out through these little holes, that draws some liquid back in at about 30 millimeters of mercury. The pressure inside the capsule, just by the fact that there is fluid out there kind of pushing in on the capillaries, is about another 15, so that altogether there's about a pressure of about 10 millimeters of mercury pushing on the way out. And then this is sort of the average pressure. It can vary depending upon what's going on with your blood volume or some other situations in your body. But basically there's always a slight amount of pressure, net pressure, pushing the filtrate out of those capillaries and into this collecting system that becomes the tubule of the nephron. There are 3 mechanisms involved in maintaining a constant filtration rate, things that will adjust to increase or decrease the pressure in the system to keep the blood being filtered. The sympathetic nervous system, of course, is involved in flight or fight responses, and so when you are in a stressful situation, you do not want to be filtering very much urine. You want the attention of your body to be someplace else. So the glomerular filtration rate, the GFR, will decrease during times of sympathetic neural impulses because the afferent arterioles are caused to constrict, which in this case will slow down the blood flow. The hormone and it's hormone-like because renin is actually an enzyme. This renin-angiotensin system responds to lower blood pressure. Renin is an enzyme produced by the kidney. It acts on a protein in the blood, a protein made by the liver called angiotensinogen, and it turns it into angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 then is transformed into angiotensin 2 by another enzyme found in the lungs. And angiotensin 2 acts to do a variety of things such as vasoconstriction or increasing the amount of aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone. Both of these serve to keep sodium in the body, and then water follows sodium back in. So it would be following it from the renal tubules back into the bloodstream. So this is in response again to lowered blood pressure. And increased thirst is another side effect of angiotensin 2. So it causes the person to want to drink more, to again put more liquid into the body that will eventually end up in the bloodstream. And then there's a hormone that we didn't talk about much. It's part of the produced by the heart. So you see this word atrial telling you the heart. Atrial natriuretic peptide, and it affects sodium the other way, so it's responding to raised blood pressure, causing more sodium to be excreted so that water will follow sodium out of the body. So these are some of the key things that are involved in keeping the filtration rate constant at the same level. This chart shows you some of the concentrations of the certain chemicals or certain molecules that are found, comparing the plasma to the filtrate that has come out of the glomerulus, and then urine itself when it is coming out of the bladder. So in between these two is when you're going to have all of the reabsorption and secretion. In between these two, it's pretty much going to be staying the same because the plasma just gets dumped out of the glomerulus and into the tubules as the filtrate. So by looking at this chart, you can see that with a substance like sulfate or phosphate or urea, which are all byproducts of the metabolism of protein and are toxic in large amounts, that the numbers over here in urine are much larger than the numbers when they are coming out of the plasma or the filtrate. But for something like glucose, which is a substance that we don't want to lose because it is so important in keeping all of our cells metabolism going, it is higher in the plasma and in the filtrate than it is in the urine. In fact, in general, it is not found in the urine at all. So that this gives you an idea about how the concentration is adjusted drastically, either to make things more concentrated in the urine or to make it less, depending upon whether our body wants to get rid of that particular molecule or hang on to it. So this is called reabsorption. Things are moving out of the tubule and into the, actually it's moving from the renal tubule into the interstitial fluid, and then from the interstitial fluid into the peritubular capillaries. So it's got a multiple steps to get there. But the proximal convoluted tubule, which is the first part of the nephron after the glomerulus, is where most of the reabsorption happens. About 70% of reabsorption occurs there. It's about 6 times longer than any other part of the nephron, so that its main job is for reabsorption, and it's given a big, long space, relatively speaking, for that to happen, just like you see your small intestine, which is absorption, being the largest part of your digestive system. So some of the things that are reabsorbed: glucose, large amounts of water, small amounts of urea, various proteins, creatine, the various amino acids, which are all listed here, and some of the other acids that are important, and some ions. So these are reabsorbed by the proximal convoluted tubule when our body says, wait a minute, I'm not ready to throw those things out yet. They need to stick around. And then secretion occurs when substances are added into the tubules that are coming out of the bloodstream. They didn't go through for the filtrate to begin with, or something has changed in homeostasis, and here at the last minute, let's quick make a change. And so these things are moving from the plasma in the bloodstream of the peritubular capillaries into the interstitial fluid, and then into the renal tubules. Active transport mechanisms are involved in both situations. I should have put that on the other slide, so that the tubular cells are ones where you have many mitochondria to power all those active transport. You also see, along with the chemicals or the molecules that were mentioned previously, you're going to have drugs moving in and out. sometimes earlier in the proximal convoluted tubule, sometimes in the distal tubule, so that the drugs are being removed from the body by the kidney. So when you take a medication, it's not going to stick around forever because your kidneys are going to send it out. This little chart tries to show where these things are happening. And so reabsorption are these pink arrows and secretion is the blue arrow. And you just have to remember that the secretion is coming from a peritubule capillary, which is running right beside, or it's probably looping around here, so that it's not just going out into the blank space in the middle of nowhere, the way this picture tries to show. But most of the work is happening right here in this proximal tubule, and as I said, this diagram is not to scale because that should be about 6 times longer than everything else. You can see that we're still having possible reabsorption and secretion all the way down to the collecting duct. There actually is a tiny bit of secretion that can happen here. So when pH needs to be adjusted, the bicarbonate ion will move in and out of the distal tubule, and it'll also move in and out of the collecting duct, so that this is where the final adjustments are made for pH. Urine composition then will vary somewhat from time to time. It depends upon how much water you are drinking, what needs to be eliminated from your body. But basically, you're going to see that it's mostly water. It's going to contain mostly these byproducts of protein metabolism, and then small amounts perhaps of amino acids and other types of electrolytes, depending upon what else is going on in your body. The color gives you a good idea about how your internal water balance is. And so you want to stay in these almost colorless to very pale yellow color of urine. Anything below 3 is suggesting that you are dehydrated or you are suffering from some physical condition. Say, if you've got liver disease, suffering from jaundice or hepatitis, you end up with urine that's about the color of iced tea. And I have personal experience with that. But for the most part, when you're healthy, you want to keep your urine very pale in color by drinking enough liquids. Then you know that you are well hydrated and your body has the fluid balance it needs to do all of those metabolic processes. There are some things that can show up in the urine that you don't want to see because they're indications of a problem. Blood is something that a urinalysis may test for. Blood in the urine will say that there's some kind of infection or some inflammation along the urinary tract. So it could be something like a bladder infection or a kidney stone that has pierced the walls of the collecting duct, or depending upon where inside of the kidney, wherever it's located. It could be something as serious as kidney disease or cancer. Sickle cell anemia also can lead to blood in the urine. Glucose in the urine, of course, is a good sign that somebody might be suffering from diabetes mellitus. The glucose in the bloodstream has to move. The high glucose in the bloodstream will then become high glucose in the filtrate, but it has to move out of the filtrate back into the bloodstream through a active transport system, and so you only have a certain number of carrier proteins in any cell to move the glucose, and if there is so much glucose in the bloodstream, it'll just completely overwhelm the carrier system, and then the excess will spill out into the urine. Also, liver disease and certain hormonal disorders can lead to glucose in the urine. Having protein present in the urine is another indication of kidney disease, that the body is not able to catch the protein and bring it back in to reabsorb it. Could be cancer. Ketones are a product of fat metabolism, and it's an indication that carbohydrates are either not available if someone is suffering from starvation, or that there's some sort of disorder of the carbohydrate metabolism system, and so the carbohydrates are not being able to be utilized. It can also be one of the first signs of diabetes mellitus. With my goats, I have to watch out for the state of having too much ketones in the urine, or ketosis, especially for my mother goats that are carrying triplets or twins or triplets, because sometimes they can't eat enough to fuel those babies growing. And then the last one, bilirubin, which gives that dark color to your urine. That is, of course, a breakdown product of red blood cells, but if it's someone is suffering from liver disease or hepatitis, an infection of the liver, the bilirubin may spill over into the blood and then color the urine as it's excreted as a waste product. So after you've made the urine, where does it go? How is it transported? Well, nephrons are continually producing urine. It just doesn't stop. That filtration system, the blood keeps pumping through your body. It keeps on getting filtered by your nephrons. It keeps on getting concentrated down into urine. And so it basically trickles down your collecting duct system to the calyces and the renal pelvis, then moving into the ureter. And the ureter is a peristaltic system. It is covered with smooth muscle tissue around the outside of the tubes, and so it is constantly moving the drops of urine down to the bladder. So your bladder is filling up even if you're lying on your back. I suppose even if you were standing on your head, peristalsis would move it. And then your bladder collects the urine until a stretch receptor tells the brain that it's full. It's time to do something about it. There's, a bathroom down the hall that you need to go visit. There's both an internal and an external sphincter holding the liquid in the bladder. Only the external one is under voluntary control, but that usually is enough. And then the urine leaves the bladder through the urethra. Females, of course, have a much shorter urethra, which can lead to more problems with urinary tract infections. Micturition is the fancy word for peeing, urination. And so these are the steps of the micturition reflex. First of all, your bladder is filling. The detrusor muscles, which is the muscle around the bladder, relaxes to let it room to expand. The internal urethral sphincter is closed tight, and the other sphincter, which is part of your pelvic floor muscles, which were muscles we didn't really talk about earlier in the year when we were looking at the muscle system, but they are also contracted. So both sphincters are closed and tight in this condition, but the bladder is relaxed and filling. Usually that when the bladder is about half full is when your brain first starts telling you, you may need to find a bathroom soon. But again, your sphincters are still closed tight. It's just this is when we feel the fact that there's urine in the bladder. The urine trickling into the bladder never shuts off as long as you are properly hydrated. It's the only time it's ever really empty is immediately after you have voided it. Because as soon as you get up and start moving around, your bladder is starting to fill again. Usually we decide to go find the bathroom when it's about 3/4 of the way full. And at that point, you can relax the pelvic floor. As I said, these are voluntary muscles. And so that in combination with this involuntary contraction from the muscles that surround the bladder, then empty the bladder and you're all set till the next time it fills up. What are some common disorders of the urinary system? The urinary tract infection is certainly something that many women have experienced. As I said, they have a very short urethra, and so they're more likely to suffer from urinary tract infection. It can stay just in the bladder or can actually travel up to the upper part of the urinary system and get an infection in the kidney. Another word for the UTI is cystitis. Typically, antibiotics can treat urinary tract infections. People who suffer from them more chronically may make changes in what they eat. Specifically, certain juices like cranberry juice does help acidify the urine and prevent the bacteria from taking hold in an infection. Kidney stones are more common in men than in women. And in a kidney stone, you have a solid crystal forming somewhere in the kidney. It can be calcium oxalate or calcium phosphate or uric acid. Those are the most common components of kidney stones. They can be as small as a grain of sand or as large as a golf ball, evidently. And can be quite painful because they usually are not round like a golf ball. They have little sharp edges and they're pointing into parts of the body, or they're stuck in one of the collecting tubules and causing inflammation and pain. If the kidney stone is moving through the system, it can just be a situation where you're waiting it out. But there is a lithotripsy, which uses ultrasonic waves, high-frequency sound waves, to basically pulverize the kidney stones while it's still in the person's body, and then the smaller pieces can pass down through the ureters and the urethra and out. There also is a laser treatment where the laser is inserted up into the kidney, so of course this is one of these little tiny fiber optic situations, and then it zaps the kidney stone directly there, and then we wait for all the pieces to come out. So these are less invasive methods than the old-fashioned way when you had to actually, if the kidney stone was bad enough, you had to surgically go in and find it. And then a third common disorder that is experienced by many people as they age is stress incontinence, which is a little bit of leakage from the bladder when someone coughs or sneezes, when the whole system is put under stress because of a muscle contraction, or overactive bladder, which is an overly strong urge to urinate even when the bladder is not particularly full, leading to leakage or sometimes worse, somebody running to the bathroom and not being able to hold it. Overactive bladder is more a psychological condition. Often a lot of improvement can be made by sort of mentally training your brain not to respond when there's the urge to urinate. Stress incontinence, usually they recommend physically trying to exercise the muscles of the pelvic floor and tighten them up. So that covers what I wanted to say about the excretory, or specifically the urinary system. There'll be one more video for this unit talking a little bit more about pH and electrolyte balance.